Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
This is 21st century Britain, but still there are people without homes, still people living rough on the streets, including some who are in work, even some doing vital jobs in the public sector, low paid and increasingly struggling to keep a roof over their heads. Central government doesn't keep statistics on the working homeless, but we do know that overall the number of homeless people is once again on the rise. The latest quarterly figures show a rise in statutory homelessness, while nearly 80,000 households in England are in temporary accommodation, a 61% increase from the 49,000 reported back in March 2011. There's also been a rise in rough sleeping. That number in England has doubled since 2010, with the latest estimate suggesting 4,000 sleeping rough in England alone, up 133% since 2010. A recent report from the local government ombudsman points to rising private rents, pushing even those in work to the brink. One key indicator is the numbers who have to claim housing benefit to help make their rent payments. Shelter says the number claiming the benefit who are in work has doubled in less than a decade to 22% in 2017, up from 11% in 2008. As part of our series of reports and discussions on homelessness, our reporter Paul McNamara has been to Wrexham in Wales, where homelessness has risen by 60% in a year to meet those in work but struggling to stay off the streets.
It's getting worse because it's cold and everyone's got a nice warm house to go in. It's Christmas now and they're going to be all with their family, and I'm not going to be there with my family this Christmas.
When I see her down, it cuts me like a knife, knowing that I can't provide for her, because I don't want her to be like this.
Danny and Carla don't just walk these streets, they live on them. They're heading to a shelter, as are many others. The number of rough sleepers in Wrexham has increased 60% in a year. But there's no guarantee of a bed, and they're only here because this is a night when Danny isn't at his job. Far from a fallacy where all homeless are beggars, Danny's a man who's in work, but out on the streets.
I normally do like 3-4 nights a week, but I'm off next week because there's no work until the following week, so... Yeah. But it's just one of the things. But if I can work 7 nights a week, I'll work 7 nights a week, just to get the money for somewhere, just to try and sort things out, do you know what I mean?
Danny's contract is 0 hours. His pay is minimum wage, cleaning industrial ducts and vents.
So you work till night and then during the day, you must be knackered.
I am knackered. I walk around like a zombie, and it's hard, but there's nothing I can do. You just have to make the most of things. Every now and again, you meet up with a bunch of mates, like the people who are homeless around here. Now and again, we sit off somewhere nice and quiet, and I might get a couple of hours, you know what I mean, on a sleeping bag or blah, blah, blah. But other than that, you got to go with the flow. There's nothing I can do.
So relieved the nights Danny has work, but not worry-free. What about his girlfriend? Like many on the streets, she suffered family breakdown. She wants to tell her story, but doesn't want her face to be shown.
Hopefully one day something will turn up and we'll get a place together and get out of this freezing cold.
Carla has been homeless for 5 months. When Danny works, they put their trust in a network of friends to keep her safe. On Thursday nights, the friends meet here, at a makeshift soup kitchen provided by Nick, a volunteer.
Get your soup in.
Danny and Carla's story isn't news to him. He knows many other rough sleepers who work and the extra difficulties they face getting access to help.
Working through the night and then sleeping through the day, that sounds exhausting.
Yeah, in a tent, in a ditch. It's disgusting.
Is that where they are, in a tent?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then trying to do a full night's work after that?
Full night's work after that, and then sleeping rough in the day in the tent. Not able to access proper, because obviously sleeping through the day, that's when any food services are offered. So, I mean, there's no sort of thinking about individual needs and that sort of thing. So this lad, for example, he's not able to access any of the services if there's breakfast offered in the mornings because he's either coming home from work or he's sleeping.
So how many homeless people are in work? Well, there are actually no formal records, but analysis of housing benefit data by Shelter found that 1/3 of households in temporary accommodation are in employment. In London, that rises to half. In theory then, rough sleepers who are working and not battling addictions should be the easiest to help. In reality, for exactly those reasons, they are low priority for local authorities. With the littlest help, making that simple but huge step into accommodation is hard.
It can be incredibly difficult. I'm sure you're aware that when you go to rent a property, you are looking at paying 1 month's rent in advance, plus a deposit, plus any letting agents' fees, which in Wales we are trying to lobby for that to be scrapped. So people are looking at potentially £1,000 up front to be able to rent somewhere.
It's a lot of money if you're sleeping on the streets.
Yeah, which people don't have.
On cold nights like this though, forget a permanent home. Often even a bed at a shelter can be too much to hope for.
Basically, you only allow 16 people in the shelter, and if I'm in there and there's more people turning up, there's more chance that I'm getting out.
Carla is least eligible for a spot in the shelter because she's not from Wrexham. The council says, like many other councils across England and Wales, resources are finite and they have to prioritise locals. On this night, Danny and Carla won and lost their daily game of chance. The shelter had space for Carla. Danny's work had no space for him.
Well, now joining us from the House of Commons is Labour's Siobhan McDonough, MP for Mitcham and Morden, and the Conservative MP and former Housing Minister Grant Shapps, who himself slept rough for a night to better understand the issue. And with me here, Lord John Bird, founder of The Big Issue. But first, let's go to a soup kitchen in Ealing in West London and talk to the organiser, Andrew Maclay, along with Mark Harvey, who's been homeless himself. Andrew, how many have you got in there tonight?
I think we have around about 50 to 60 in here tonight. It sounds very loud.
Now, are you able actually to give them accommodation tonight? I mean, can they sleep there, or you're just feeding them?
Well, we feed them and we provide them with entertainment. In terms of accommodation, we refer to a few organisations for that. So we look after every other need that they have besides accommodation.
Now, have you seen an increase in the numbers of people coming to see you in the last year or two?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, when we started this, we started with about 40 people on a Monday night. Sometimes we get up to 150 here, so it's a marked increase. Even in terms of men and women, it used to be that you'd see about 80% men, 20% women. Now it's about 60% men, 40% women. So something's going wrong.
Mark Harvey, I saw you nodding your head when I asked whether there'd been a big increase in the last year or two. You were yourself homeless. Who intervened, or what intervened, to put you back into some kind of housing?
I was homeless in 2005, 2006 for 9 months. I was on the street from December until September, and what forced me to get myself back in line was in September. The temperature started dropping. I'd done 1 winter sleeping on the streets, and I couldn't do 2 winters. And because I was a homeowner in Ealing, I knew Ealing Council had a duty of care to me, so I went to the housing and spoke to them, and that was 11 years ago. And but now I work with helping people on the streets.
You're now there in the centre, clearly helping Andrew. What's your sense of what is happening around you right now? Do you really sense there is an increase?
Yes, there's definitely been an increase. The figures that we're looking at, I'm looking at the official government stats, we say 4,000, just over 4,000 people homeless on the streets. And a few weeks ago, the Greater London Authority acknowledged that there was 8,000 people living on the streets, with 2,700 just in Westminster alone. I go out giving hand warmers out in the streets, hats, gloves, and I see the numbers increasing.
Right, thanks for the moment. We'll be back to you in a moment. But John Bird, you've had a very long perspective from the early 80s right through to today, Big Issue, which you launched as part of a campaign to try and ease the crisis. How do you read the present situation?
Well, the trajectory is bad news. We seem to be increasingly finding more and more people on the streets. My take on it is slightly different, because what I've noticed is, especially around the big issue and the people that I talk and meet on the streets, is a lot of them are suffering from mental depression, problems around that. And I would say, and I've described...
Of course, homelessness itself would bring on mental depression.
If you're not mentally ill, try homelessness.
Yeah.
And the thing is, as I've said it in the House of Lords, we're almost like an A&E department. The big issue is turning into an A&E department. You don't have the provision for people who have fallen into homelessness. Homelessness creates social problems, creates physical problems. So you've got this kind of weird thing where the streets are where we're trying to sort out many of the problems around the National Health Service, around austerity. Austerity has knocked the feet out of the poorest in society. And also you've got the added fact that there are people who are moving around the country looking for work, and the work is not there, or it's not there at the rate. The added to that, and I think this is the real sign that we're returning to a bit of Victorianism. At the end of the 19th century, there were a lot of people who were working on the docks who lived in the streets. They were homeless. And what we're getting is people being homeless actually working. And that is a really destructive piece of chemistry.
Let's go over to Westminster then, and let's begin with you, Grant Shapps. You actually did a night on the streets to see what it was like. What's your analysis of why we are where we are?
One of the things is I think you just have to keep on top of homelessness all the time, and I think there can be no doubt that the moment the eye is taken off the ball, you start to slip backwards. I became sufficiently concerned just in the first few months of doing the job as Housing Minister, having set up a homelessness foundation before that, that if we didn't keep everything in place, we would start to see homelessness rise. And for a long period of time, a couple of years, I had monthly meetings where I would meet with the then sort of director of all policy across government, that was Oliver Letwin, and we discussed how to deal with, for example, the welfare changes, make sure that housing policy kept up with that, and took a whole load of different initiatives, including launching an app and a website and a phone number called StreetLink, which still runs to this day and has helped now thousands of people get off the street. So you've got to do it the whole time. If you just don't happen to have people who are really focused on this issue, then I'm afraid the upshot is, for all the reasons that John Bird was just talking about and others, which is that homelessness actually, of course, is to do with lack of housing, but it's actually also to do with the whole myriad of complex reasons. If you don't get your health policies right, your welfare policies right, your housing policies right, and much else besides, then it is very easy to end up in a situation where the number's increasing, and I'm afraid that's what's happened.
Siobhan McDonough, where does this start? Does it start with the failure to build public housing?
I think it starts with the failure to build enough public housing. I think it starts with an increased dependence on private rented sector accommodation. Certainly in London and the South East, there's always somebody who can pay more in rent than you can. There's no security of tenure, so it's very easy to lose your home and find nowhere else to go. In the clip you heard about the amount of money you need for a deposit and a rent in advance, and if the council don't think you're in a priority need category, that means that they're not going to help you find what is thousands of pounds.
Well, Grant Shapps, there are solutions. I mean, there is prefabricated housing. There are all sorts of ways in which an emergency, massive national effort to provide housing could be launched right now. And your government's in power. It has the wherewithal. Why doesn't it do it?
Yeah, I mean, governments have been struggling with trying to produce this housing for a long time. I was part of trying to do that. There is something that is worth mentioning, which actually follows on from Siobhan's point. We've both just voted for it, actually. There is a Homelessness Reduction Act, which has just been passed and has to be enacted. Now, I want to see ministers actually put that into law urgently in 2018 because, and this is really important, one of the cases that you were just covering, in fact lots of people will be familiar with this, is where people have gone to the council before they've become homeless, and the council says, sorry, come back when you're homeless. And that's not good enough, and you actually have to have that help coming in sooner. And that's what the Homelessness Reduction Act
Let's get what to do.
I'm trying to get in because I'm not saying a lot of people share my view, but I think that's just going to provide more bureaucracy. My council, Merton, they're regularly on the phone to the landlord saying, look, Won't you keep them? Could we give you a bit of money? Will you keep the person? If I get somebody who's got trouble with their housing benefit, I can get somebody to go down to the housing benefit department and sort it out. If you add in universal credit, you have just got such a nightmare. I don't think we've even begun to see what might happen as universal credit kind of rolls out across the country.
Well, but let me ask you something which might unite the two of you. The awful phrase affordable housing has crept into the dictionary. And it is utterly meaningless in terms of resolving the homelessness crisis.
Well,
Grant Shapps, can't you knock it on the head and talk about unaffordable housing and time to build affordable, actual council housing?
Well, most housing is unaffordable, as you say, and even when it's shown as being or suggested being affordable housing, affordable to whom and in what circumstances? But I think the answer to your question is, and you asked me before and I didn't quite get to the point, if you are going to solve the housing crisis, you need to build 1 million homes, 2 million homes. And I suggest you're not going to do that by just trying to find extra plots of land, particularly in London, the southeast, which is pretty developed. You're going to have to build brand new establishment, brand new towns. I think new garden cities built actually across the country at a scale that makes them sustainable, so we can have like a proper step change in the amount of housing available in this country.
Siobhan?
The truth is there isn't one solution. Yes, we need a joint action. We need councils, we need the health service, we need Transport for London, we need the government to all act together that the first priority is housing. Because if it's not the first, it will be the last.
Can I thank you both very warmly? I'm going to have to move to the Ealing Homeless Day Centre, which is dealing with people tonight, the night shelter. Let's go back to you, Andrew. Have you heard anything which makes you feel that anything will be different in the next 2 years?
That anything will be different?
Yeah.
Well, I wish that was the case. You know, I think, but we talked a little bit about affordable housing, but I mean, I was homeless briefly when I moved to the UK in 2008, and it wasn't because I couldn't afford a place, it was just because there was a social isolation. And I think the reason that sometimes places like this exist is because there isn't anywhere else for people to go. You know, there's a real, London in particular, I think it can be a very isolating and a scary place. And I think for that reason, I'm not sure that our numbers are necessarily going to go down. Right. I think, you know, I think affordable housing does have a part to play in that. But I also think, you know, whilst we live in our own sort of little bubbles, I just can't see the situation getting any better.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. John Bird, thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry we haven't had longer to talk, but thank you very much indeed.
I wish we could bring in the low-wage economy, which means that the poorest in society don't have the bounceability to absorb this terrible austerity.
Let's leave that ringing in people's ears and get them to think about it. Thank you very much indeed.